Chapter 7, Act 7, Luca's Tale. Act 7, Luca's Tale. The Clockwork Heart.
Princess Luca. You're all right. And Miss Rydia is with her, too.
Luca marched into the castle amid a frenzy of cheers and sighs of relief from the dwarven guards who were gathered in the keep, assessing the damage from the airstrike. Although the bombing had looked terrible from where Rydia and Luca had been holed up on the Falcon, the reality was that King Jot's castle was one of the strongest structures on the planet, constructed from iron mined from the darkest, deepest depths of the underworld. One could rationalize that his castle had been forged in the fires of hell itself. There had been some smoking piles of rubble the girls had needed to weave around as they made their way inside, and many decorative items like vases and mounted weaponry had been destroyed when they crashed into the stone floor, but overall, the castle looked no worse for wear than it had 17 years ago, before King Jot had finally given in to the demands of his people to put some effort into restoring their dwarven capital to its former glory. When Luca's mother had been alive, she normally tended to such affairs while Jot was off building his army and uniting the whole of the underworld. After she had passed away unexpectedly while giving birth to Luca, King Jot had poured all of his attentions into his only daughter and ruling the kingdom alone, and thus anything that was not deemed an emergency from a maintenance perspective was left unattended. His people had never gone without and were well taken care of, but even the most unmaterialistic of dwarves had their limit as to how shabby they would let the exterior of the castle become.
Were there any casualties?
Luca demanded, and the guards shook their heads.
Lolly-ho. None reported, ma'am. A few dwarves got hurt from the surprise attacks by the monsters, but they're already resting safely in the hospital wing. They'll be up and raring to go again in no time. What monsters?
Rydia blinked, and one of the guards looked up at her.
That girl who attacked us was something fierce. She had some kind of weird, exotic power, where she could make monsters appear out of thin air. All types, and many we've never seen before. We were powerless against her,
another guard added sadly.
It was best for us to stand our ground and finish off what she threw at us. We knew the monsters were meant to be a distraction, but there was nothing else we could do. They would have gone too deeply into the castle and hurt civilians had we not stopped them. Girl.
Rydia trailed off. She hadn't thought any women were in the Red Wings. Perhaps it wasn't Baron's Air Force after all. That would have let her breathe a lot easier. Ever since she had seen the flash of the Crimson ship and the cannon fire, her heart had felt like it was caught in her throat.
What kind of person can make monsters appear out of thin air?
Luca huffed.
You're sure you weren't seeing things?
A summoner could do that, Rydia thought to herself. But there are no other summoners in the world that wield even a fraction of the power needed for an attack like this.
Positive, Your Highness,
a guard nodded.
Any dwarf that was fighting will agree.
Rydia and Luca looked at each other, and Luca shrugged.
I need to see my father. Is he in the throne room? Yes, Your Highness. He confronted the girl, but escaped unscathed. Father.
Luca shook her head and took off for the throne room. Rydia ran after her, calling her friend's name and shooting the dwarves a grateful look for the intel as she struggled to keep up. Even though Luca's medicine had helped her recover some strength, she still felt exhausted from her ordeal in the Feymarch. What she had seen and experienced couldn't have been cured by even the most skilled white mage in the world. Luca exploded into the throne room, making the two guards that were flanking her father's throne nearly fall over in fright, thinking another surprise attack was occurring.
Father! Are you all right?
King Jot leapt from his throne, rushing to Luca and scooping her up into his arms, which was no easy feat with Luca already eclipsing him in both height and muscle mass.
My stars! That's what I want to ask you, Luca. Blundering around on that airship of yours. But never fear. My fortress was built to stand strong against bombing assaults as feeble as that one.
Luca let the cutting remark about the Falcon slide for now, hugging her father tightly and closing her eyes. Rydia sheepishly stepped through the open door to the throne room, and gave a quick curtsy as to not interrupt the tender reunion unfolding before her.
It is good to see you again, King Jot.
King Jot peered over Luca's shoulder, patting her back assuredly before pulling away.
Ah. Welcome, Rydia. It's been ages, it has.
Luca knew what Rydia was going to ask next, so she decided to cut to the chase. After all, why else would their castle have been attacked?
The crystal, father. Is it safe?
Jot frowned and looked away.
We weren't able to protect it. Unfortunately, it was taken, and by just one young woman, no less. She looked me dead in the eyes as she broke into the crystal chamber, as if I were no more a threat to her than the dirt under her feet.
Rydia let out a strangled cry.
What?
My fears for the safety of the crystals. They weren't unfounded. And we were too late. Luca heaved a sigh. She had to keep reminding herself that not all was lost, everyone in the castle had survived, after all, and that was all that really mattered. As troublesome as it was, the crystal could be retrieved. Cecil and Rydia had done so once before, after all.
The guards told me about her. Is it true she had an army of monsters?
King Jut nodded.
She was no ordinary girl. In fact, she wielded the exact same powers as yours, Rydia.
Rydia swallowed the lump that had formed in her throat.
That's impossible.
Luca turned to face Rydia, shaking her head.
The same power as Rydia? You mean she can control eidolons? Is that what the guards meant when they said monsters came out of thin air?
King Jut lifted his Viking helmet away from his head, running his sleeve over his sweat-ridden brow.
That's correct. She used that power to shrug off my most battle-hardened dwarven guards and snatch away the crystal with ease. And I'm sorry to say that the ship she rode in on was very familiar, it was definitely one of Baron's. How could something like this happen?
Rydia whispered, staring at the floor. The overwhelming dread that had nearly crippled her in the Feymarch was slowly seeping back into her shaking limbs. Leviathan and Azura. And now this. There must be a connection between the fallen eidolons and the stolen crystals. Luca put her hands on her hips, spitting a barrage of questions as her cheeks flushed crimson.
But why are the Red Wings involved in this? Where is Sid? You are sure you didn't see anyone else but the girl, father? Sid would never allow his ships to be used in an act of treason such as this.
King Jut patted Luca's shoulder.
Do not misunderstand me, I am not laying blame with Baron yet. You hardly need to worry about that man, Luca. He is as stout and hardy as any dwarf I have met, I know he would not allow this to come to pass willingly.
Rydia looked up at King Jut and Luca, a flush of frustration crawling up her cheeks.
Something's happened to Cecil. And to Baron. I'm sure of it. There's no other explanation for why they'd bomb this castle without reason. I must get to Baron as soon as possible. Cecil, Rosa, Theodore, and Sid. They could all be in terrible danger.
King Jut sighed, flopping his massive helmet back onto his head. Instead of adding height and majesty as it normally did, it just made the defeated king look more shrunken and childlike.
The wars of the past are about to spring forth anew. That much, I fear, is certain. Shortly before you two arrived, my men confirmed for me that the enemy's forces already have 3 of the dark crystals in their hands.
Rydia clenched her fist.
So where's the last crystal?
Luca turned to Rydia and reached into her jumpsuit, pulling out a familiar strand of pearls.
The sealed cave.
She clutched the necklace in her fingers, and looked to Jot.
Father. I'm heading over there to make sure the crystal is safe.
Both King Jut and Rydia widened their eyes in horror. Jut shook his head dismissively, holding out his palm.
Luca. You have already put yourself through enough danger. If you go there.
Luca smiled slyly.
Oh, father, I'll be fine. I'm not going alone, anyway.
Rydia frowned.
Hey.
Who else did Luca know that would possibly be willing to brave that cavern of horrors? Was she going to recruit some bodyguards? Luca laughed and shook her head, trying to blink away the tears that had started to creep into the corners of her eyes as she gazed back down at the necklace in her hands.
Besides, the only way to get in is with this necklace I have, right? I want to be the one who uses it this time. It's all I have left from Mother.
Rydia stared down at her feet. I can't possibly let her go alone. The sealed cave is far too dangerous, even with Luca being as brave and strong as she is. If we locate the final crystal of darkness, we may also locate the person who petrified the eidolons. What if they hurt Luca too? Rydia pressed her lips together, taking hold of Luca's gloved hand and squeezing gently.
Luca. In that case, I'll accompany you. I can help you disable the traps of the cave and navigate. It's a daunting place, but nothing we can't overcome together. And after we've secured the crystal, I'll take you to Baron.
Luca grinned, and the girls shook on it. King Jut groaned and shook his head.
I never thought I had raised such a stubborn child.
Luca puffed out her chest and flashed a victory sign.
Like father, like daughter, you know.
King Jut narrowed his eyes.
Just remember to be careful. The Tower of Babel has begun to glow ominously once more. I fear this is only the beginning of more to come. My only condition for allowing you to go is that you spend the night here and make your way in the morning. Neither of you are in any condition to take on the cavern right now. I don't know what happened when you two went to the Fame Arch, but Rydia looks like she's about to fall over.
Rydia flushed and looked away. So, her feebleness was that transparent, but she was grateful for the moment of respite resting at the castle would give her. It had been a whirlwind of a day, and she needed to do some serious thinking if she was going to psych herself up for their trip to the sealed cave.
And Rydia, when you go tomorrow, make sure my daughter doesn't get into trouble. Yes, Your Majesty.
Luca was so excited that Jut had hardly put up a fight. She didn't even bother arguing with her father about the tiny condition he had laid upon them.
And I'll be here to help you out, Rydia.
Jut collapsed upon his throne, his eyes rolling up toward the ceiling.
My dear ladies, please do not overextend yourselves. We've enjoyed peace for many years. But now, I'm afraid, the time has come to reinforce our defenses. I believe that the two of you will do what's right, whatever may come to pass.
Rydia looked away. She didn't like the underlying tone of that statement. Did he mean if Baron had betrayed them, that they would need to cut their ties? Rydia with her friends, and Luca with her master?
Rydia.
Luca slung her arm over Rydia's shoulder, pulling her tightly against her side as she started to lead them out of the throne room.
I'm going out to the shipyard to work on some stuff before we go tomorrow. You know the way to my bedroom, right? I still have a bed in there you can use. You should go to the hot springs in the infirmary, as well. That'll fix you right up better than any medicine. Oh, and if you're hungry, put in an order at the pub, they'll deliver whatever you want to my room.
Rydia nodded, trying to force a smile. Had this been a visit under any other circumstances, she would have been looking forward to the royal sleepover, just like the two of them used to do when Rydia still lived in the Fame Arch. Even though Rydia's biological age was 33, she would have been much closer to Luca's age had she never been swallowed by Leviathan. She liked to fantasize that even if they hadn't met under the arduous circumstances of war, they still would have become dear friends in another life. But I probably would have never met Cecil, Rosa, Kane, or Edge, Rydia mused. I wonder just how different all of our lives would have been had Golbez not become a muse puppet. He probably wouldn't have targeted Baron. Cecil and Kane would have never had need to come to Mist.
I think I will go to the hot springs,
Rydia relented. Her mind was going down a dark path she wanted to steer far away from.
See you later tonight. For sure,
Luca nodded, squeezing Rydia's shoulder before pulling away.
Don't wait up for me though. If you're tired, just go to sleep. We're going to have a big day tomorrow. Oh, wait.
Rydia called to Luca's retreating backside. Luca glanced over her shoulder.
You told Jot before that you weren't going to the sealed cave alone. What did you mean by that? Oh, that's what I'm working on now.
Luca grinned.
All will be revealed tomorrow. Never fear.
Before Rydia could ask any more questions, Luca skipped away, disappearing in a swell of dwarves that had started to gather in the antechamber that was the crossroads to other parts of the castle. Despite the castle being assaulted and having their crystal stolen, the early evening meant it was supper time, and dwarves were not wont to let trivial matters such as war get in the way of their next meal. Rydia drifted downstairs toward the infirmary, registering the occasional greetings she would get from the dwarves that knew her from when she hung out with Luca, but only managing to raise her hand in reply. With each step she took, she realized that she really was exhausted, both mentally and physically. She wondered if one of the nurses would drag her body out if she ended up falling asleep in the hot springs. Once she arrived, Rydia stripped out of her clothes, gathered her copious amount of hair into a sloppy top knot secured by her hairpin, and sank into the salty, bubbling water, cringing at first from the stinging sensation that rushed all over her slightly healed over, but still exposed cuts. But after the first minute of pain came the wave of warm, melty relaxation that Rydia was looking for, and she let out a small sigh as she sank further down, the water brushing over her chin. Across the way from her, there were two dwarven women chatting about their day. It sounded like both of them were nurses whose shifts had ended right before the Red Wings' assault. For a few moments, Rydia let herself drift away from consciousness entirely, mentally drawing shut a pair of blackout curtains over her brain. But after what felt like only a few minutes, she heard someone's voice calling out to her, and her eyes snapped open. The two women who had been talking were staring at her, smiling.
hey.
One of them exclaimed.
You used to come around with King Cecil and Queen Rosa to visit that crazy old man who was hospitalized here, right? During the war.
Rydia blinked, still groggy enough that she didn't understand what they were talking about. Finally, it hit her. Oh, of course. The crazy old man they are talking about has to be Sid. After he had hurt himself trying to bomb an enemy ship, he was laid up here for quite a while.
Yes.
Rydia smiled kindly, surprised that they even remembered her.
Sid is doing well. Were you his nurses? We were.
The other woman smiled.
He was the worst patient we ever had. So impatient and loud. He complained about all the food. And got angry when we wouldn't let him walk to the bathroom unsupervised. But it was because he would make a run for the shipyard and try to work.
Rydia giggled.
That sounds like Sid, all right. I'm sorry to tell you he is still like that. He has a grandchild now and is still as much of a workaholic as ever. He's taken Princess Luca on as an apprentice, too. We heard such rumors.
One of the nurses shook her head.
No one can deny Luca's talent with machinery. The king is dismayed, but what can he do about it? Our Luca is the future, and whether he likes it or not, she's going to radically transform this kingdom with her own hands. Didn't there used to be a handsome ninja that would accompany you?
The other nurse asked, and the other one burst out laughing. Rydia felt her cheeks flush far deeper than was justifiable by just the heat of the water.
Edge. King Edge. Yes, that was him.
The other nurse nodded.
Oh, how Sid would rant and rave about him. Calling him a spoiled upstart, going on about how he was going to get you all killed, and other things that make me cringe just thinking about them. Unrepeatable things, mind you. Do you see much of him anymore? We don't get a lot of news about Evelyn down here in the underworld, even though we're technically connected together by the Tower of Babel.
Rydia trailed off for a moment, feeling the words get caught in her throat like sticky nectar.
I mean, I don't see him so much anymore. I guess it's been a long time. But I think he's doing well. Edge is. Edge.
And that was the truth. But she found it difficult to admit out loud, even to two relative strangers.
Still no queen for Evelyn, then.
The first nurse giggled.
Maybe I still have a chance? Do you think he likes women with beards?
Rydia forced herself to laugh along with them, even though it felt and sounded like she was gasping for air.
Honestly, I've never seen him meet a woman he didn't like. I think you need to make a visit to the surface. Ha. Thank you for entertaining an old woman, dear.
The nurse smiled.
Enjoy your stay at the castle. Thank you,
Rydia said softly. She closed her eyes again, pressing her palm over her chest as she sank yet deeper into the water, letting the salty water burn her chapped lips. A tight, twisted feeling had settled in her chest, and it was all too familiar, although she hadn't felt it for a long, long while. It had been late in the evening when Rydia heard Luca finally sneak into her bedroom. Even though Luca had been making an effort to be as quiet as possible, for her, Rydia would have still woken up if a pin had dropped. Rydia quietly watched Luca sit on her bed and pull off her boots, then proceeding to strip off her jacket and romper and pull on her nightshirt.
Luca.
Rydia asked softly, and Luca blinked as she pulled the nightshirt over her head, the curls in her bob springing back up through the neck hole.
Oh, hey. Sorry if I woke you. No, I was up.
Rydia sat up in bed as if to illustrate her point.
Did you finish your project? Oh yeah.
Luca grinned.
Can't wait to show you. It's going to be a blast from the past.
Rydia shook her head.
I don't even know what to think about that.
It feels like the past has been haunting me more in the past 24 hours than it has in the last 17 years.
Good, I want you to be in suspense.
Luca smirked.
All ready for tomorrow? As ready as I'll be, I suppose. Did you learn anything else about the attack today while you were in the shipyard? A little,
Luca nodded, sliding under the covers.
I got a decent description of the girl. You did?
Rydia blinked.
You think we could recognize her if we ran into her? I have little doubt.
Luca trailed off.
It sounds like she looks a lot like you.
Rydia clutched her blanket, feeling as if ice water had just been poured down her back.
What?
Luca shook her head.
Listen, most dwarves don't spend a lot of time with humans, so they think you all look alike. So we have to take this description with a grain of salt. I was told she had wavy teal hair that was shoulder length, and wore ruby jewelry. She's pale, but in an ethereal, beautiful way, they said she glowed. They described how she summoned the monsters, and... well, I mean, it sounds like how anyone would summon a monster, I suppose.
Rydia knew that when Luca said anyone, she meant
Rydia.
Rydia was the only summoner she had ever known, after all.
I see.
Rydia looked down at the sheets pooled in her lap.
Did their description remind you of anything in particular? I'm not sure I'm following,
Luca frowned. Rydia closed her eyes, thinking back to the barrage of visions she had experienced on the Falcon as she watched the dwarven castle get assaulted by the Red Wings.
Like the imposter from 15 years ago, that Cecil and the others found in the sealed cave.
Luca drew in a sharp breath, and Rydia could hear the springs in her bed shifting.
I mean, I remember her a little, but it's foggy. I was so young,
Luca said softly, having turned to face Rydia.
But what I seem to remember from back then is that she looked exactly like you. Cecil, Sid, myself. Everyone was tricked. The dwarves didn't say this new girl looked and acted exactly like you. Just similar.
Everyone had fallen for it except Edge, Rydia mentally corrected Luca, biting down on her lip. And why does that even matter anymore? Rydia pressed the tips of her fingers together.
We never found out what she actually looked like, I'm just wondering if there is some kind of connection. She was able to summon monsters too. But the Feymarch was totally normal that day, no one had been petrified. Rydia.
Luca shook her head.
You've really been in your head since I picked you up from Mist. Is there something else on your mind? I know a lot of terrible things happened today, but... the Rydia I know is resilient and determined no matter what chocobo crap gets kicked up in her face. Did anything else happen you want to talk about?
Rydia quickly shook her head.
No. I've kept us up enough with my chatter. I'll feel better tomorrow, I promise. I think I just need a full night's sleep. Okay,
Luca conceded, closing her eyes.
Good night, Rydia. Good night.
The next morning, Rydia decided that she did feel much better. She was surprised at how her outlook had improved overnight. Her sleep had been dreamless, and the hot springs along with a hearty dwarven dinner before bed had made her sleep like a rock after Luca had passed out. It also felt revitalizing to be in a place full of people again. Being in King Jot's castle made her feel like she was in the Feymarch, where there was always activity no matter what the hour. In Tiny Mist, where you could count the village's maximum population at any given time on all your fingers and toes, sometimes it got a little too quiet. Despite her longing for peace, falling asleep alone in dead quiet was unnerving for her. It was one of the reasons why she had asked if she could become housemates with someone when she moved back to Mist, so that there could always be some sort of activity around her at any given time. Luca took Rydia out to where the Falcon was parked, and Rydia noticed that two short people, children, perhaps, were running around on the deck of the ship. As they got closer, one of the children noticed them and pushed the button that released the ramp, which came barreling down to the ground. Climbing aboard, Rydia gasped in surprise. The two figures were not children at all, they were remarkably lifelike dolls. One was crafted in the image of a little human boy, and the other a little human girl. Both had porcelain pale white silicone skin, large glass blue eyes, and mops of goldenrod hair. The boy's hair flopped in his eyes in a messy pageboy cut, while the girl's hair was pulled halfway back with a red ribbon and spilled over her shoulders in fat sausage curls. They were dressed in matching formal clothes. The boy was wearing a puffy white button-down shirt with a red silk vest and blue slacks, while the girl wore a layered red and white collared dress with a billowing petticoat. The little girl ran up to Luca and Rydia, giving a crooked bow.
Oh, hey.
Rydia blinked, bowing back. Her doing so made the girl smile. Luca giggled.
I told you we weren't alone, didn't I? These are Kalka and Brina. They'll be a huge help to us this time, I'm sure of it. This time.
Rydia pressed her lips together. Luca let out a nervous laugh.
Oh yeah. I forgot, you weren't around. These used to be my favorite dolls when I was a kid. But one of Golbez's nutjob minions stole them and ended up cursing them to attack Cecil and help steal the crystal in my father's throne room.
Rydia made a face. There was only one of Golbez's henchmen that would have been sick enough to steal a kid's toys in order to turn them into weapons, the same person who had desecrated Edge's parents' bodies and turned them into reanimated monsters.
Sounds like the work of Dr. Lugai.
Luca nodded.
Yeah, that seems about right. Most of my dolls were destroyed in the battle, but I managed to save these two and restore them. I may not seem like it, but I'm really good at sewing. I made all their clothes and stitched their wigs myself.
Rydia crossed her arms over her chest.
So in order to bring them to life. More of Sid's work.
Luca puffed out her chest proudly, her hands on her hips.
I fixed them up, actually. My airship expertise gets me a pretty long way with these things. Their intelligence is limited, and they can't talk, but I managed to program each of them to a fair extent. Kalka here is a tank and reinforced with steel underneath that cute face of his. He'll be our bodyguard. This sweet little boy.
Rydia giggled, and Kalka looked over at her from where he was standing at the steering wheel, and reached to the belt holding up his slacks, pulling out a massive knife that Rydia hadn't noticed was on his person. He waved it to her excitedly as if to show off what a big boy he actually was, and she could feel all the color draining from her cheeks. Luca laughed when she saw the look on Rydia's face.
He'll be harmless to us, promise. And his sister, Brina, is a healer. I've filled her with the ingredients that are used in various types of magic items. Her body breaks them down and will cast a random spell, like synthesized white magic. Pretty cool, right?
Rydia shook her head in awe.
Luca. It's more than cool. Sid is going to flip when he sees what you've done.
Luca beamed.
That's right, he will. Now, then. I came up with a plan, and I want to know what you think. First, I think we should go to Kokol's forge and get some new weapons. Okay.
Rydia nodded. She supposed if she could no longer summon eidolons, she was going to need something that would help her in a fight other than her old whip. If she was going to rely on her magic and be smarter about it than she was in the Feymarch, she would need a powerful rod to amplify her powers without draining her mana.
Next, if you wanted, I thought we could quickly stop by the Sylph Cavern. Maybe we could check on them.
Rydia offered a sad smile in reply. The Sylphs, along with the eidolons she had befriended, had not answered her calls either. But it was sweet of Luca to propose seeking them out. Rydia had little hope for what they would find, but realized as soon as Luca had said something that she couldn't forgive herself if she didn't even try to find out what condition the gentle Sylphs were in. They had been so kind to her when they lent her their powers, and to Yang when he had been comatose and under their care, she owed them that much. Luca counted out a third finger on her hand.
And then finally, the sealed cave. We'll be more than ready for it after all of our prep. What do you say? It sounds like you've thought of everything,
Rydia said, and Kalka and Brina each jumped in the air and did a synchronized twirl. Luca patted Brina on the head, and she looked up at them eagerly.
With these two, we're going to whip through that cave in no time. Kalka, fire up the engines for me and set the navigator for Kokol's. Off we go.
Hours later, the four of them had completed everything on Luca's list. Unfortunately, neither Kokol's forge nor the Sylph Cavern had yielded particularly positive news, resetting the tone for the day from cautiously optimistic to heavy-hearted. Upon arriving at the forge, both Luca and Rydia were dismayed to hear from Kokol's apprentice that the famous blacksmith had passed away only a few weeks ago, although his death had been peaceful.
My master met his eternal reward, proud of the great feat he accomplished forging the holy sword, Excalibur,
his apprentice had shared, with a sad smile on his face.
And I can only hope to carry on the legacy he built. I'll miss him,
Luca sighed as they returned back to the Falcon.
We hadn't really needed any of his services since the war ended, but he and my father were still good friends, they had grown up together. He'll be heartbroken when the news reaches his ears. Cecil too, I'm sure,
Rydia frowned.
He still treasures Excalibur to this day. He had told me after Theodore was born that someday, he would bequeath the holy blade to him.
They did not leave the forge empty-handed. Kokol's apprentice had done a fine job of outfitting Luca with a drop-forged steel tomahawk that was light enough for her to carry one-handed and use as a projectile, giving her far more versatility than she would have had with a two-handed hammer. For Rydia, the apprentice had remembered her from when she had come with Cecil to forge Excalibur, and offered up one of Kokol's final creations before he had passed, a beautifully sculpted ice rod made of blue gold and topped with a three-pointed azure ice crystal. At the Sylph Cavern, Rydia had stumbled through the overgrown, lush plant life that made up the cavern's interior as the group's makeshift tour guide, since neither Luca nor the dolls had ever set foot in the Forbidden Paradise. It was well known among dwarves that sylphs, delicate fairies whose strength only became evident when they swarmed their enemies, were at heart peaceful creatures but had no desire to associate with man or dwarf and were extremely shy. As a result, very few dwarves had ever met one in person, and the number of humans that had was even smaller than that. Although they weren't eidolons, the sylphs had offered to forge a covenant with Rydia when it was discovered that an injured human man they had been caring for, Yang Fang Leiden of Fabul, had once been part of their party in the fight to save the crystals from falling into Golbez's hands. In the years since Rydia had forged that covenant, the twisted vines of the blue crown passion flowers that had once shied away from the rivers of green poison that snaked through the rivets of the cavern floor were now blanketing them. As a result, Rydia and the others had been able to pass through safely, without the intervention of magic.
After all this time, the flowers developed a resistance to the poison.
Rydia trailed off.
And they even appear to be thriving as a result. These flower heads are bigger and brighter than I've ever seen them, they've absorbed the bioluminescence of the poison, too.
Luca crossed her arms over her chest as they walked.
It's a process called natural selection. Over the years, as the flower population was exposed to the poison, the genes of their seedlings were likely altered. I'm sure the insects that live in here are immune to the poison as well, they would have pollinated the flowers, and when new ones were born, they were stronger than their predecessors because their genes were mutated. Now, the poison can't kill them anymore, they've adapted to their environment.
She pointed up toward the ceiling of the cavern, where Rydia had remembered there were once canopies of flowers, now there were mostly dead and dry vines, and clusters of cave bats.
And the ones up there that didn't eventually perished. Soon, they'll replaced by their progeny. Like humans, I suppose.
Rydia pressed her lips together.
And dwarves,
Luca added.
There is no species on our planet that can escape from evolution. There are some scientists that say the planet itself is evolving.
Rydia shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. She didn't know why, but the very thought of that gave her anxiety. How had the twin moon evolved that was hanging from the sky now? It didn't just suddenly materialize, right? When they had reached the majestic, but long-neglected cabin buried in the depths of the cavern that the sylphs took residence in, Rydia did not bother knocking on the door that was hanging half off the hinges. Steeling herself by taking a deep, shaking breath, she pushed it open, and let the light from the cavern flowers pour into the entryway. Luca hung back with the dolls, an arm slung around each one to keep them from rushing forward. Rydia was greeted by silence and a shower of dust light drifting all around her. The sconces hanging upon the walls had long been lacking any flame, and were cool to the touch. On the rotting planks that made up the cabin floor, she could see perfectly formed, petite footsteps crossing the grid toward the parlor. Hanging suspended in midair were a pair of sylphs, their shimmering platinum hair now a sooty gray, and their polished onyx eyes void of light. After sharing a meager lunch on the Falcon's deck, although Kalka and Brina just watched amusedly, much to Rydia's discomfort, Luca took point upon their entry of the sealed cave. Not knowing what to expect, Rydia was surprised to see that the torches that flanked the entrance of the cavern, made of various skulls bound together with strips of leather cord and were impaled upon a long stick, probably another type of bone, were burning brightly, like a macabre welcoming committee. They had been lit 17 years ago, too. She wondered if they never went out, or if someone from Jot's castle routinely checked on them. One thing that was different, however, was the skeleton that normally sat next to the entryway to the cave proper was now gone. She had remembered needing to put Luca's necklace around the skeleton to gain entry last time. Luca watched Rydia's eyes flick to the doorway, and nodded.
The skeleton that was there got destroyed when all of the monsters poured out of the cave 15 years ago,
she explained.
They had forced the seal open from the inside, and flew out in a mad stampede. Cecil and the others were able to just waltz on in. I see.
Rydia looked down.
And the imposter was inside waiting for them. Right. Yes, that's what I remember Cecil telling me.
Luca frowned.
She was in the crystal room, passed out on the dais. There had been no attempt to remove or harm the crystal, and she went with him willingly. She asked him to take her to the Tower of Babel, which is of course where you found them, and kicked her butt back to wherever she came from.
Rydia smiled weakly, shaking her head.
It sounds weird, but I feel like I should remember everything that happened in this cave 15 years ago, even though it wasn't me.
Luca bit down on her lip, looking away toward the solid marble double doors before them that would take them into the true entrance of the sealed cave. She decided now was a good time to change the subject.
Thank goodness. The seal's still intact. Which means whoever is causing us trouble now hasn't been able to get to the crystal.
Rydia nodded thoughtfully.
We made it in time.
Luca whirled around to face her, her eyes darkened with worry.
I sure hope so.
Rydia blinked.
What is it?
Luca put her hands on her hips.
Well, now you've got me thinking back to the monsters that exploded out of here 15 years ago. If the Red Wings threw their full firepower into it, they may be able to break the seal by brute force.
Rydia gulped. Luca was absolutely right, unfortunately. The Red Wings were the most powerful military force on the planet, there wasn't much they couldn't decimate. And if they had a summoner leading them, that multiplied their destructive power by astronomical amounts.
Then what are we waiting for?
Luca shook her head. Kalka and Brina mimicked her, their blonde hair bouncing in the candlelight.
You're right. Let's go.
She lifted the pearl necklace from underneath her jacket, lifting it high in the air and closing her eyes.
Brandish thou the seal unraveling mark, and the path to the dark crystal shall be open.
There was a loud crack of lightning that filled the chamber with light and made the ground shake. Rydia cried out and clutched onto Kalka and Brina, who were frozen stiff. The marble doors protecting the sealed cave blew open, and a rush of hot, putrid air blew over the four of them. Luca made a face, fanning the air.
Whew, maybe with that stink, no one would actually want to break in here. Regardless, we've got to get our hands on the crystal first.
Rydia winced as her eyes tried to focus once more after the painful flash of light.
And then what?
Luca slammed her fist into her hand.
Then we'll head for the overworld with the Falcon, and let the boss and everyone know about this. With Cecil and the others protecting it, the crystal will be safe as possible.
Rydia could feel the panic starting to rise in her throat. She swore that the cavern torches began to flicker, just as they had when Golbez had assaulted them in this very spot 17 years ago and snatched the crystal right from under their noses. By a double-crossing proxy. She shook her head, trying to physically dispel the awful memories that were flooding back.
Are we really ready for this?
Luca, who had no idea what had happened on that dark day, merely flashed her trademark victory sign.
Yup. We'll show 'em what my master's Falcon can do. Besides, I'm sure you're worried about Cecil and the rest, aren't you?
Rydia nodded reluctantly.
Yeah.
Luca flipped her hair back and adjusted her goggles on her forehead.
Come on, let's get going.
As they began their descent into the cave, Rydia tried to distract herself from her disquietude by trying to remember the route she had taken through the cave with Cecil 17 years ago, so that they could repeat it today and run into as few traps as possible. Even back then, she had been terrified by the cavern, and she hadn't even known all of its horrible secrets upon entry. Stepping into the sealed cave was little like entering a portal to hell. Magma from the surface level of the underworld poured down the cavern walls in all directions, drowning the entire atmosphere in a steamy, fiery glow that did little for the otherwise profound darkness that seemed to claw its way up from the furthest depths. The crystal chamber was at the very bottom of the cave, carved into a ledge that could only be reached by climbing down several sets of fraying ropes that were left hanging from random ledges, the bridges between the rocky plateaus long rotted or destroyed. The climbing had been the worst part of all. Rydia could handle the trapdoors that would come to life and try to eat your hand as a snack, and the legions of undead that would quietly sneak up on you or scratch at your ankles from piles of bones scattered on the ground that otherwise appeared to be benign. When she had last gone through the cavern with Cecil, Rosa, Kane, and Edge, she had put on a brave face and forced herself to climb down all of the ropes herself, even though she could have just as easily summoned an Eidolon to take her from one platform to the next. But the Eidolons she knew at the time would not have been able to fit all 5 of them, and she had not wanted to risk separation from the others nor, worse yet, did she want to be seen as a coward. But now, summoning an Eidolon wasn't even an option anymore, and that stung worse than even the rope fibers that tore through her uncalloused palms. The more she thought about it, the more Rydia felt like she had been defanged. But Luca took everything in stride, even offering to carry the dolls on her back as they climbed down so that Rydia could focus on just getting herself down safely. They had developed an awkward, but acceptable routine. Luca would climb down the ropes first, and set the dolls loose on any monsters that were waiting for them. She would then wait for Rydia at the base of the rope, who would inch her way down and fall the last few feet into Luca's arms.
I feel like I'm not being any help at all.
Rydia frowned as they completed yet another level and began to cross into a winding tunnel.
Rydia, if you weren't telling us where to go, I'd be wandering around in circles,
Luca said, lovingly punching her shoulder.
There are so many chambers in here, and they all look the same to me. It's amazing that you remember as much as you do about this place.
They paused for a moment, watching with a mix of fascination and aversion as Calco launched himself upon a prowling Katesith, a large, yellow cat with whiskers that crackled with lethal levels of electricity. Calca expertly sliced the cat's throat with his knife from atop its back, avoiding the twitching whiskers entirely as the cat collapsed to the ground. Brina stood at the side of the battlefield, doing a twirling dance that was generating a protect spell around her brother, even though the monster was well on its way to dead.
So do dwarven dolls normally come with hunting knives like that, or was that your own addition?
Rydia blinked.
Well, how did you learn to use weapons?
Luca asked, totally serious.
Of course, all of our dolls came with their own gear. And now I'm starting to understand more and more about how you ended up the way you are.
Rydia shook her head, smiling.
Oh, and for the record, human dolls normally just come with clothes. Maybe a hairbrush if you were rich and could afford one of the nicer ones that actually had hair. I was not one of those lucky few. I definitely know what I'm getting you for your next birthday, then.
Luca grinned, and Rydia shook her head.
No, I'm good. Really. Thanks though.
When they reached the rope bridge that crossed the final chasm to the crystal chamber, Rydia paused for a moment, blocking the bridge and turning toward Luca and the dolls.
The last time I was here, there was a final trap that was sprung after we acquired the crystal. It was a demon-infused wall that tried to run us off the ledge.
Luca tapped her chin.
Did you guys destroy it like you did the trap doors? Yes. I summoned Leviathan to help.
But... Rydia looked down.
That's not an option anymore. But you know lots of other magic, right?
Luca smiled.
So we'll be fine. And that's even if the trap is reset, seems unlikely if you blew it to pieces with the king of the Eidolons himself. I hope you're right,
Rydia frowned.
But I just wanted everyone to be prepared for the worst.
They gingerly crossed the bridge, forced to cross single file to both better distribute the weight and because it was hardly wide enough for either of the girls to walk together, nor for each of them to walk with a doll. Rydia noticed that Luca kept gazing down into the depths below, where the magma that had been pouring down the cavern walls and following them in their descent all afternoon still could not be seen pooling. They were still at least a mile away from the true bottom of the cave.
If you keep staring, you'll just get dizzy and nervous,
Rydia offered gently. Luca looked away and shook her head.
Oh. It's not that.
Rydia asked, but either Luca didn't hear her, or she didn't want to elaborate. Once they had safely reached the other side, Rydia stepped up to the crystal chamber doors to get a better look. If she was remembering correctly, last time the doors had been emblazoned with a carving of a man, and that had been what turned into the demon when they tried to escape. But this time, the ivory-colored, marble doors were smooth and featureless. Rydia let out a small sigh of happiness.
Perhaps you are right, there's no evidence of a trap this time. Of course I'm right.
Luca winked.
You're not the only one with spot-on intuition, Missy. We dwarves call it instinct. Right.
Rydia shook her head, and gestured for Luca and the dolls to come closer. On the count of 3, they shoved their cumulative body weight against the doors, forcing them to slowly grind open. As the doors began to part, Rydia could feel the warm, hallowed light of the crystal of darkness pour over her body. There was no doubt that the crystal was safe, shedding its light like it always did. Calca and Brina stood by the doors, on watch as Rydia climbed the dais and reached up, taking hold of the crystal. She realized that she had never actually touched one before, and marveled at how alive it felt within her hands. She couldn't tell if the pulse she was feeling was from the beat of her own heart, or from something deep within the amber-colored glass of the crystal. As Rydia gazed upon it, she saw her own emerald gaze reflected back at her, and then briefly saw the color of her reflection flicker from green to amber, and then back again. It had only been for a second, but she was positive about what she saw.
What?
Rydia blinked, stumbling backwards. Where have I seen those eyes before? She nearly fell down the steps of the dais in shock, and Luca rushed up behind her, grasping her upper arms and steadying her just in time.
Rydia!
Luca cried.
Are you okay? Yes.
Rydia gazed down into the crystal again, but it stubbornly only showed her reflection once more.
Did you see that just now? Something flashed in the crystal. I couldn't see over your shoulder, sorry.
Luca blinked.
Maybe a trick of the light? The crystal dulled a little when you took hold of it. Oh.
Rydia bit her lip.
Maybe that was it.
She tucked the crystal in her arms, cradling it like a newborn child.
Let's just get out of here. Can the dolls take point?
Luca nodded, turning toward Kalka and Brina.
Okay you guys, we're going back up now. Lead the way.
Kalka and Brina both bowed, and turned to walk out of the crystal chamber. Luca followed them, and Rydia stole one last glance at the now empty dais before scrambling after them. As soon as Rydia crossed the threshold between the crystal chamber and the bridge that would take them across the chasm and on their way out of the cave, she felt a familiar trembling beneath her feet. Her stomach sunk as she whirled around, watching as a sheen of light washed over the now closed marble doors to the crystal room and began to expand outward, solidifying into a rectangle that took up the entire length of the strip of land they could walk on before needing to cross the bridge. Another flash sparkled from behind, and Rydia turned just in time to see a vein of sparkling light spread across the entryway to the bridge. Kalka and Brina pounded on it frantically, only to be thrown to the ground. It was a barrier, and it had blocked their only means of escape. Luca's gaze moved from the dolls to the unnerving monument that was forming before their eyes. The rectangle of light had transformed into a solid grey marble wall, and clawing its way through it like it was struggling through quicksand was a pair of glinting claws attached to skeleton arms, along with a smooth, chattering skull that was filled with triangle-shaped teeth and had narrow, milky slits for eyes, like someone had thrown a bucket of hot wax on its face and carved out crude slashes over the burned and dried-up eyeballs beneath. Luca gulped.
And this would be the demon wall, right?
All Rydia could do was nod. Luca scratched her head.
You know, I might have just remembered that Cecil mentioned he had to disable the traps of the cave again when he was rescuing fake Rydia from the crystal chamber. Oh. Well, that's good to know.
Rydia trailed off. Her eyes were still trained on the demon wall, which had now successfully wedged its claws into the ground between itself and the party and had begun to drag itself forward, tearing deep crevices in the cavern floor as its claws dug in. It would only be a matter of minutes before it had reached the ledge, meaning that Rydia, Luca, and the dolls would have no place to go but over, into the boiling magma below. Luca stared at the wall incredulously.
So, what now?
Rydia blinked and pressed her hand to her forehead, which she realized was blazing hot. Now was not the time to be lost in thought, but her heart was still beating erratically from what she had seen in the crystal chamber, and the dulled crystal now felt slippery in her hands from sweat, and cold as glass. She needed to get her head back into the situation before them, and fast.
Luca, can you find a way to slow it down?
Rydia asked shakily.
I need a few moments to cast a spell. I think I have something in here that will help.
Luca muttered, and began digging in her pouch.
Aha, spider silk. This should do the trick.
She launched the glass vial at the wall, which shattered upon contact and left a sticky white web plastered over the demon's face. The web began to expand and stretch over the entirety of the wall, covering it in a faint glow. The demon reached up with its claws, angrily scratching at the webs and halting progress for at least a little while. Rydia backed away as far as she could manage, until her backside had hit the magic barrier by the bridge. Still clutching the crystal to her chest, she closed her eyes and tried to calm the hurried rush of her heart. It had been too long since she had cast a spell of such magnitude, and the last time she had done so, she had turned it against her mirror image, the shadow woman who had stolen her likeness and tried to murder her friends. But Rydia knew nothing less would do if they had any hope of defeating the demon wall themselves, and without her eidolons, she had to call upon the forbidden black magic, meteor. Heavens above, tear asunder and heed my cry for aid, destroy my enemies and all those who threaten the sanctity of the crystals. I, Rydia of Mist, implore that the will of the stars themselves become one with my own. The cavern began to darken, and shriek of whistling cut through the air from high above. Luca gasped, kneeling next to Kalka and Brina, who were cowering in her arms. Rydia's breathing became ragged and heavy as the first meteor burst from the sky, smashing into the demon wall and leaving a black smudge of ash as it bounced off and flew into the abyss below. Rydia gritted her teeth, clenching the crystal so tightly that the blood circulation to her hands became strained. I need more power. Must concentrate. More meteors began to rain down, at first trickling in like a spring shower, but began to steadily increase in size and strength as they pummeled into the wall. Fist-sized portions began to break off, and fractures climbed up from various impact sites, weaving through the wall's form like spider webs. Just as Rydia silently urged herself to push through what she hoped what would become the last wave of fatigue to ravage her body, she felt a shock of electricity run up her spine and burst in her skull, causing her to collapse to her knees and scream out. A breathy, cold voice whispered in her ear, and the flash of amber eyes filled the darkness.
The likes of you don't deserve either the eidolons or the crystals. No.
Rydia gasped, dropping the crystal to the floor and grasping her head, whipping it back and forth to try to dispel the piercing glare in the voice.
Leave me alone.
The meteors started to die down, and the room began to fill with the light of the glowing magma once again.
Rydia!
Luca shrieked.
Hold on.
She looked up at Kalka and Brina, giving them an encouraging smile.
You know what to do, right? I give the code word, and you take it from there, okay? We've practiced lots. And now it's showtime.
Kalka and Brina stared up at her, saying nothing. Luca reached in her jacket pocket, pulling out a small remote control with a slider switch and a single button. Clicking the switch, she unlocked the mechanism and let her finger hover over the button momentarily.
Go, Kalka Brina!
She slammed her finger down, and the doll's limbs began to stretch and extend several feet longer, distorting their petite bodies and causing their clothes to tear with a loud ripping noise. Kalka and Brina turned toward each other, grasping hands, and in a burst of purple smoke, merged into a massive, 6-foot doll with grinding metallic joints and lolling glass yellow eyes. Kalka and Brina's silicone flesh had retracted into their metal skeletons, leaving their combined form, Kalka Brina, more android than human. Kalka Brina turned away from Luca and clumsily stomped toward the demon wall, pulling back a fist the size of Luca's head and smashing it into one of the sets of fractures Rydia had caused with her magic. As the wall crumbled under the assault, the other fist split open to reveal a flamethrower, and began dousing the demon wall in fire. Rydia gasped for air and managed to open her eyes just in time to see the demon wall collapse into rubble under what she could swear was a giant mechanical doll's battering fists. She reached out, grabbing hold of the crystal once more and pulling it into her lap as she rubbed her eyes with her free hand. There was a flash of light, and the barrier behind them disappeared, along with the giant doll, which had transformed back into the more familiar, but now knocked out and naked, Kalka and Brina.
We got it!
Rydia cried. Luca jumped up, tucking the remote control she was holding back into her pocket and kneeling down next to the dolls.
Nice job, Kalka and Brina. Good thing I brought a spare set of clothes just in case this happened.
She dug around in her pouch and pulled out 2 new outfits. Rydia dragged herself up to her feet and walked over, silently taking Brina into her arms and helping dress her while Luca took care of Kalka.
Thank you.
Rydia's hands were shaking as she buttoned Brina's dress.
We should be thanking you,
Luca said firmly.
You set up the pins so Kalka and Brina could knock him down. And more importantly, are you okay? You were so white, I thought you had become a ghost. I'm okay now. Maybe it was too much to try to cast meteor after all this time. My body. It's not tempered for battle like it used to be. I've always been able to use black magic, but...
Rydia looked down.
I had gotten used to battling with the eidolons by my side all this time. And my body. It's just not adjusting. It won't listen to me anymore. There was another voice. And
Rydia gave up trying to explain herself and covered her face, letting out a loud moan.
Arg. This is so frustrating. It will come back to you, in time. I promise.
Luca reached under the nape of Kalka and Brina's necks, holding in a button that was so small, Rydia would have never found it unless she knew exactly where to look. The 2 dolls sat up, staring at each other with wide blue eyes before looking back up at Luca and smiling. Luca patted them each on the head, and stood up, brushing herself off and folding her arms under her chest.
Rydia. Do you know why I wanted to come to the sealed cave so badly?
She asked softly.
Even though I knew it would be dangerous.
Rydia shook her head as she nervously shifted the crystal back and forth in her hands.
No. I just chalked it up to you wanting to prove your father wrong about what you were capable of. Yet again. Well, that is true too.
Luca smiled a little. She walked over to the ledge next to the bridge, staring down into the abyss below. Kalka and Brina watched her curiously, but stayed by Rydia's side.
But more than that, I wanted to see my mom again. Your mom?
Rydia tilted her head. Luca nodded, and Rydia realized that her eyes were glassy with tears, shining from the light of the magma pouring down the walls around them.
My mom was laid to rest here. All of my ancestors are, actually. The sealed cave isn't just the home of the fourth crystal of darkness. It's also the royal family's tomb. Has been for hundreds of years.
Rydia let out a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding.
Oh Luca. I had no idea. Well, it's not like it's my icebreaker for parties,
Luca drawled, and Rydia wasn't sure if she was supposed to laugh or not.
Humans typically bury their dead, but that's kind of difficult here in the underworld. The ground is mostly rock and it's too hard to dig a hole unless you want to blast one open with a tank. So instead, we return the dead to our sun, the magma.
Luca pressed her fingers to her lips.
The royal guard would have escorted my mother's body right where we are standing, and...
She nodded toward the darkness.
The key that unlocks the seal to the cavern changes each generation as a result of a new royal being buried, because that sovereign's soul is now responsible for protecting the crystal in the afterlife. Prior to Mom's passing, the key was something else entirely, I don't even know what. But when she died, her essence attached itself to this pearl necklace, and that became the new key.
Luca twisted the strands of the luminous gemstones between her fingers.
This necklace was what my father had given to her when he proposed. As she was dying, one of the last things she told my father was that she wanted me to have it. I think she knew that it would be the new key to the seal.
Rydia pressed her hand to her mouth, feeling her own tears trickle down her cheek and drip onto the crystal in her arms.
Luca.
Kalka and Brina turned to look at Rydia, and they both silently embraced her legs, much to Rydia's surprise. She felt her chest fill with palliative warmth even as their cold, silicone flesh pressed into hers. Luca closed her eyes, clutching the necklace tightly as her steady, clear voice echoed throughout the chamber, dulling even the roar of the magma.
Mom. I finally made it. I'm sorry it's not under better circumstances, but... I just wanted to say thank you. You gave me life, and although I never knew you, I've always felt your protective spirit by my side. I've done my best to become the kind of woman I think you would want me to be. I know I still have a long way to go until I'm the queen our people deserve, but I'm working toward my dream of becoming an engineer so that I can bring all the wonders of our planet to our homeland, flight, technology, science. I want the dwarves, and our human friends, to craft any kind of future they want.
Luca sniffled and opened her eyes, gazing back toward Rydia and the dolls.
Please continue to watch over my friends and me for just a little while longer. Okay.
And please, continue to protect us as well, Mommy. Rydia prayed fervidly, pressing her forehead against the crystal and feeling its gentle radiance pour into her once more. Cecil, Rosa, Theodore, and everyone else. Please keep them safe until I can be by their side once more.
Cain, don't listen.
Rosa whispered in his ear.
Resist him.
Rydia was cowering in the corner, her mouth agape and her body paralyzed with fear as she watched Cain collapse to the ground, clutching his head while screaming in agony. After a few heartbeats, Cain lifted his head.
It's all right,
he groaned, and gently pushed Rosa and Cecil away, standing up on his own.
I'm back in control of myself.
Cecil let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Rosa held her hands to her chest, biting her lip. Rydia noticed that Edge was inching ever closer to her. Their eyes met, and his gaze implored her not to breathe a word. For once, Rydia listened to him, pressing her lips together to indicate she understood. Suddenly, Cain launched himself onto Cecil, knocking him down to the ground and bringing down his fists with as much fury as he could summon. A chorus of screams erupted from Rosa and Rydia as Cain grabbed Cecil's throat with one hand and shoved the other inside his cape, grasping the crystal of darkness and tearing it away as he stood up to flee. Rydia willed her legs to give chase, but when she tried to run, she felt Edge's hand grasping her own tightly, holding her back.
Rydia? What's wrong?
Rydia's eyes snapped open, and she shook her head.
I was just remembering something. A bad memory from a long time ago.
They were back at the entryway to the sealed cave. Luca and the dolls were staring at Rydia like she had grown a second head. Rydia flushed and looked away, but the sudden sound of lightweight, yet confident footfalls coming from ahead of them made Rydia quickly whip her head forward.
I see you saved me the trouble.
A young woman matching the description of the assailant who had bombed the dwarves had strode through the underworld-facing entrance of the cavern, a gossamer gown dragging behind her bare feet as she stopped before Rydia and arched an eyebrow.
So you're one of the last surviving summoners.
Rydia felt as if someone had punched her in the stomach. The girl before her had scintillating amber eyes, the same as she had seen reflected back at her in the crystal of darkness and the same eyes that had managed to penetrate her mind and stop her meteor spell. Right away, Rydia realized her gut had been right the entire time. The Fey March was connected to the theft of the crystals. If this girl knew about summoners, that was all the further evidence she needed.
You're the one behind what happened to the Eidolons.
Rydia hissed. The mysterious girl tilted her head and cracked a smile.
I hate repeating myself, but the likes of you don't deserve either the Eidolons or the crystals.
This girl. She was the one speaking to me in my head. Rydia thought, her heart racing. But how? Luca, who was looking back and forth between Rydia and the girl and totally confused about where this conversation was going, had decided she had enough.
Who asked you?
The mysterious girl shrugged.
There is one who's far more worthy of the crystals.
She eyed the crystal in Rydia's hands as the words fell from her lips. Kalka and Brina pushed ahead of Rydia, holding out their arms and staring down the girl defiantly.
Kalka!
Luca gasped.
Brina!
Rydia cried at the same time. The mysterious girl shook her head, raising her hand in the air. A cascade of lightning shot down from the ceiling, striking Kalka and Brina square in their chests. Wordlessly, the two dolls slumped over, smoke pouring from the gaping holes that had been torn in their circuitry. Rydia could see the sparking wires through the holes that had been burned through their brand new clothes.
These ridiculous toys! What a waste of my time! Now, hand over the crystal!
Luca clenched her fist as Rydia stepped forward, raising her chin.
I won't let you have it!
The girl shook her head, and down came another strike of lightning, crashing into Rydia's back. Rydia moaned and collapsed to the ground, the crystal bouncing out of her arms and rolling right next to the girl's feet. She bent down, scooping it up and turning it over in her fingers as if to investigate its authenticity. Luca gasped, kneeling down next to the fallen summoner.
Rydia!
Rydia mumbled, drifting dreamily between a conscious and unconscious state. The mysterious girl turned to leave, waving a hand dismissively.
With this, all 4 dark crystals are back in our hands.
Luca growled, leaping to her feet and reaching to grab hold of the girl's trailing dress.
Wait.
Without bothering to turn around, the mysterious girl summoned one last round of lightning, shooting Luca in her outstretched arm. Luca screamed as the burning pain shot through her body, stumbling backwards and falling next to Rydia.
Your lives are not my concern,
the girl hissed, and disappeared through the mouth of the cavern. End of chapter.